Today we wanted to discuss how the Kamba got their revenge. Now, this is the story about the Kamba community that lives in Kenya. They live just south of Mount Kenya. And the historical origins of the Kamba is this. A long time ago, before colonialism, there were no prisons in Kenya. So the way the communities regulated bad behavior was through ostracization and expulsion. So many people who got caught up with sexual deviancy, witchcraft, and other similar crimes would normally get expelled from the community. Now, around Mount Kenya are the communities called Gema, Kikuyu, and Bumeru. Now, once they would expel the people who are misbehaving, those people would go south. And now, south is a very arid area. So, after a while, the expelled people started to accumulate in that arid area. And it is from these expelled people that you get the ancestors of the people who are called the Kamba. Now, they're called the Kamba because of the aridity and the constant famine within that area. The people would go up to the communities living around Mount Kenya, which is green and fertile, and they would offer themselves as indentured servants in exchange for food. Now, the Kikuyu word for indentured servant is gobo or gombo, and it is from this word, gombo, that you get the word Kamba. So this is the historical origins of the Kamba community. Now, for a long time, the people who had been expelled from Mount Kenya into that arid area, they were very resentful. And this resentment manifested itself in a very interesting way, especially considering the way history played out. Now, the Kamba grew and spread and increased in number, and they ended up controlling or covering the territory from Mount Kenya all the way to the coastal plains of Kenya. So eventually they became the link between the coastal towns and the interior of what would become Kenya. So because they were in between those two territories, they started trading and they became famous as long distance traders. And they carved out two trading routes all the way from coastal Kenya to the Lake Nyanza. The first route was through Kibwezi, then Voi, then south towards Mount Kilimanjaro, and then towards what would be Kisii, and then on towards Lake Nyanza. And they would do that in order to avoid crossing Maasai territory because the Maasai didn't like people crisscrossing their land. The other route was again through Kibwezi, Voi, but this time they would turn a little bit north, go to the slopes of Mount Kenya, then cross from Mount Kenya to the south of the Aberdares all the way to Eldama Ravine and try and bypass the Nandi and end up in what is today Luya land. And again, they would try to bypass the Nandi because the Nandi did not like people crisscrossing their territory. And so, as it happened in history, with the coming of modernity, Arabs or many Arabs started seeking more trade from the interior of Africa, and the trade that they were seeking was slave trade. And it is the Kamba who guided the Omani Arabs and the Swahili deep into the interior of Kenya. They showed them all the secret routes, how to avoid the Maasai and how to avoid the Nandi, so that they could end up all the way to Lake Nyanza, where they would collect a lot of people, they would capture people to sell them at the coast into slavery. Now, without the Kamba, we know that the nascent slave trade would have never happened in Kenya. So it is the Kamba who facilitated the enslavement of other communities in Kenya by working very closely with the Omani Arabs and the Swahilis in pre-colonial times. And in fact, when the Arabs tried to do a trade expedition, without the Kamba, they strayed into Maasai territory, and in 1897 they were wiped out. And so everyone learned, if you want to be safe, get a Kamba guide who would guide you deep into the interior of Kenya. So with the coming of European colonialism, now the British and the Germans started showing up on the coast of Kenya, of what would become Kenya. And their traders also began to enter Kenya. And it is again the Kamba who guided them all the way to what is today called Uganda. And in fact, the first European to see Mount Kilimanjaro was taken to Mount Kilimanjaro by the Kamba. So the Kamba had the key to Kenya, and they used that key to unlock Kenya and open up Kenya to the foreign invaders. So without the Kamba, the task of invading and occupying Kenya by the British would not have been as easy as it was, because the Kamba were there to guide them, to navigate, to show them the secret routes into Kenya, and to also help them avoid the Maasai and the Nandi, who were known to defend their territory with all seriousness. So, colonialism in Kenya was facilitated by the Kamba, at least the colonial invasion. And we will see how even colonialism itself would not have been as successful as it was without the Kamba. So, when the initial British traders and German traders started entering Kenya, they contracted the Kamba to show them around the country. So, the initial invasion by the British was not a military invasion. It was through missionaries and traders who were sent beforehand to spy out the land and to gather intelligence about the land that the British wanted to invade. And it is the Kamba who guided these spy missions and greatly helped them gather up all the information they needed, so that by the time the British were ready to send their army, when their ships arrived at Mombasa and their invading troops started to disembark from the ships, the Kamba were there, ready, willing, and able to guide these invading armies into Kenya. And what people don't know is that a lot of the stereotypes that Kenyans have for each other, the different ethnic groups have for each other, those stereotypes were created by the Kamba. It is the Kamba who would tell the Swahili and the British that, for example, and this is a true story, they'll tell them that you should avoid the Kikuyus because those are thieves. And they will tell them you should avoid the Maasai because they will attack you. They would tell them you need to avoid the Nandi because they are violent. And they would give them stereotypes, or if you like, association types for each and every community that lived in Kenya. So anytime you're trading a stereotype, I want you to understand it was created by the Kamba as they mapped out Kenya and gave that information to the British and the Swahili who were preparing to invade the interior. So at any rate, the British troops arrive in Mombasa and they begin to prepare to invade Kenya formally. And they are guided by the Kamba. And in fact, a significant proportion of British troops which were attacking the other communities in Kenya were made up of Kamba men and Kamba potters and Kamba women. So the Kamba and the British create a joint army, of course controlled by the British, and they march into the interior, attacking the rest of Kenya. And in fact, the trade routes that the Kamba used to use to go all the way to Lake Nyanza, those trade routes is where the current road exists. When you look at the road that goes from Mombasa all the way to Kisumu, it follows step by step the Kamba trading route. In fact, the train itself, the railway, goes through the Kamba trading route. So where the Kamba stopped their trading route, where it ended in the western part of Kenya, that is where the border of Kenya was set by the British. Therefore, the shape of Kenya, the dimensions of Kenya, especially going from east to west, were clearly mapped out by the Kamba. So the territory that is Kenya is a creation of the Kamba through the trading routes that they had. Where they stopped is where the British also stopped and put the border. That is just an interesting aside to the history of Kenya that is not necessarily taught in school. So Kenya as it is right now, I would argue, is a creation of the Kamba. Once the colonial dictatorship had been established in Kenya by the British, majority of the King's African Rifles, which was the army of occupation, majority of the African troops were Kamba troops. And most of the King's African Rifles were African troops, up to 70%, almost 80%. And of that 80%, more than 60% were Kamba troops. So it is the Kamba who facilitated and helped the British establish colonialism in Kenya. It is Kamba troops that fought other Africans and crushed other Africans using modern British weapons. And in fact, once the war began for independence in the 1950s, it is the Kamba who were sent as part of the King's African Rifles to suppress the independence movement and the Mau Mau. And in this war that was fought between 1950 and 1960, over 11,000 people from Mount Kenya were killed. And what is interesting, those are the same people that had expelled the ancestors of the Kamba to the arid areas. So it kind of came back to bite them. And that is one of the ways that the Kamba were able to get their revenge for being expelled from Mount Kenya by the ethnic groups that lived around Mount Kenya. Because people many times wonder, why didn't the Kamba see the contradiction in their behavior? That they were fighting against independence for Africans. They were on the side of the colonialists. They were on the side of the British. They were on the side of the settlers. Why were they so opposed to the independence movement that was being led and carried out by the people of Mount Kenya? It's because of that memory of historical resentment that they had been expelled, or at least their ancestors had been expelled from Mount Kenya into the arid south. And so they felt no loyalty or love for the people of Mount Kenya. And they greatly assisted the British in brutally putting down that rebellion. After independence, between 1960 and 1970, majority of Kenyan army troops were Kamba troops, mixed in with a little bit of people from northeastern and western parts of Kenya. But the bulk of the troops were Kamba troops because historically, the Kamba and the British were always working together on the colonial project that was Kenya. Now, today, the role that the Kamba plays is that after independence, the British left Kenya. By and large, their companies remained and their massive, extensive land holdings still remained, but the bulk of the British people left Kenya. And in leaving Kenya, they left Indians. Once the British and the Kamba had invaded Kenya, the British imported Indians to come and work on the railway. Now, we did not give these Indians any visa or any permission. They are still colonizers. They are part of the colonial project, right? And so once the British withdrew, they did not live with the Indians. And they should have left with the Indians because they came in with them. At any rate, they left the Indians in Kenya, who were then declared to be Kenyans with full citizen rights. And so what happened is that the Kamba immediately allied themselves with the Indians, and today the Kambas normally work with Indians. And how this played out in Kenya is interesting because the Indians control the majority of the Kenyan economy. And this control started immediately after independence, once the British left. And what happened was that the Indians hired the Kambas, who willingly flocked to the Indians to work for them. So that if you went to an Indian in quote shops, the person who would talk to you first is a Kamba man or a Kamba woman. Okay? And in doing that, they kind of acted as a shield, protecting the Indians from resentment by other Africans. Because you could go into many, many towns and majority of the shops were owned by Indians. But there'd be a Kamba up front. So because the Kambas kind of acted as a go-between between the rest of Kenyans and the Indians, the resentment that would have built up against the total Indian control over the local economy within many towns didn't happen. That resentment did not happen because there was a Kamba man acting as the face of the business. Yet behind the scenes, the business was owned by an Indian. And so in this way, the Indians were able to spread their control over most aspects of the economy of Kenya, so that without the Kamba, the Indians would not be dominating the economy of Kenya as they do today. So it is courtesy of the Kamba that we are still under control by, Indian colonizers. And again, there is specific competition between Indian traders and traders coming from the Mount Kenya region. And so it's very rare for you to find Kambas working for traders who come from Mount Kenya region. The Kambas normally work for the Indians. And so they've made a historical choice to consistently work with the enemies of their ancestors. And that way, the colonial project in Kenya still continues, because if majority of the economy of Kenya is controlled by foreigners who invaded the country 100 years ago, that's part of the colonial project, isn't it? We still haven't recovered our total independence. We do have flag independence, which means we as Africans, we have the right to raise a flag and to lower it. That's it. But the economy is controlled by outsiders. And these outsiders would have never succeeded to the extent that they did without the Kambas. It would have been impossible. And in fact, even the European settlers that were in Kenya during colonialism, owning a lot of the land, majority of the people who used to work for them on those stolen pieces of land were Kamba people. And so the colonial project in Kenya is only successful because of the Kamba people. And in fact, the entire creation of Kenya was only made much more easier by the fact that the Kamba collaborated with the colonial invaders. And so it is in this way that the Kamba got their revenge.